Welcome to the next episode of Common Ground. As always, I'm Deb Ryan, and I'm joined by my co-host Teresa Hartman. How are you?
Hi, everybody. Great to be here.
It's good to see you. We've been off for a few weeks. We've both been really busy with lots of things, but there's been a lot going on. So we've got a lot of things to cover. But we're going to start with Bill Gates. He put out an essay earlier this week, and it's riled people up. And so we thought we would sort of dive in terms of like, what did he say? What did he put out? And like, how have then our different communities been reacting? Because I think you and I have had some interesting conversation offline about what's showing up on LinkedIn and Substack from our different networks and stuff. So, and as always, make sure you like and subscribe as we dive in. So, Teresa, why don't you kick us off? Like, just give folks an overview, and we'll link the essay that Bill Gates wrote, which is 17 pages long. It's long.
It's 17 pages long, which I think explains why. So the commentary has been commentary has been really different on like the two sides of the aisle. Some people are really riled up. Some people are really supportive. I think my main takeaway is that nobody actually read it. Like, I genuinely think that most people did not read the 17 pages because all the commentary that I read was about one headline.
Uh-huh.
And if you actually read the 17 pages, it's a completely different story. But so like the headline is truth number one, right? So Bill Gates puts out a memo. He calls it 3 Truths About Climate Change. And he's basically wanting to put this out. He's like, here are 3 things that I want everybody at COP to know, right? So like we're going into the Conference of Parties, the International Climate Conference in a couple of weeks' time, actually like
Yep.
nowish. And this is sort of like his input into the process. So he calls it 3 truths that everybody should know about. And the first truth is what's got everybody riled up on my side of the aisle. But it basically says climate change is a serious problem. So he says it's a problem, but it will not be the end of civilization. And people freaked. How is the reaction on your side?
And again, I would agree. It's just been that headline where everything that I am seeing is like, see, we told you climate change is a hoax and we don't need to worry about it, and everyone can just calm down and move on.
It's not a hoax. Like, let's start with it's not a hoax. And he never said it was a hoax.
Yeah. So, but again,
Yeah.
that's been because that's often the piece in that first truth that he talks about a lot is around the idea that access to energy is what drives human growth and human prosperity. And it's something that I see used in the energy industry and in the oil and gas industry a lot in terms of the justification for why fossil fuels should still be produced. And on one hand, I don't disagree with that because, again, when people don't have access to energy, they can't cook food efficiently, like they don't have lighting. And so like children can't do school and all this kind of stuff at night and all this kind of stuff. So there is definitely, particularly when people are and have very, very low energy use, access to energy is huge and it's life changing. But there's a point of diminishing returns on that on the other side. And we can and that's the bit that really annoys me. And particularly with a lot of the messaging I see coming out of the US.
Yeah, like at some point you need more than
Yeah.
energy, right? So like you
Yeah.
get to a point where like you have lighting, you have heat, you can heat your house, you can read a book, you can study better because you have access to electricity ultimately. But there's a limit, right? Like at some point you need economic opportunity, you need healthcare services, you need infrastructure around yourself so you can actually make something of yourself, right? Like so you can start a business or work somewhere or find opportunity. And that's not solved by energy access
Yeah. And
alone.
the
I
piece
would
that
say it's a necessary precondition. It's just not sufficient for economic development.
Yeah. And the piece that annoys me in even Gates's language around this is that he specifically talks about growth. And
And
like capitalism is all about growth and like continual growth of businesses. And I think, again, like I said, it gets to a certain point where there's diminishing returns on that. And it's, growth to what end?
on
And I
growth.
think, yeah, like economic growth is for families that have been maybe living in poverty and stuff like that, that's huge and significant. But when it is coming from the billionaire
Oh, you
class,
mean like economically, if like the economy grows, it doesn't
yeah.
actually trickle down.
Well, but some of it when growth gets to a point though, when we are talking about someone like Bill Gates and broadly the billionaire class who are growth at all costs and driving this consumerism behavior, like the US is terrible in terms of how much stuff we have for what, right? Like, so the Amazon can make bazillion dollars. Like,
And
why?
then lay off 15,000 people in an economy where they were making money and slimming the workforce at the same time, right? So, like, the profits that are being generated by these, like, mega corporates aren't trickling down at all. They're
No.
actually
So
being highly, highly concentrated to, like, an upper layer of management or ownership.
And so this is, and we can dive into it, but this is the piece. And it's something that I get very frustrated when I hear this from, again, from energy companies and from, again, the billionaire class, right? It feels a little bit condescending. And at least
Okay,
Bill
so
Gates,
you're angry
yeah,
at the piece because Gates opens up with this idea of we need to invest in energy because energy is going to drive growth. And you're basically saying it's two things, right? It's like one, that like energy isn't actually enough. And like two, all of this talk about growth actually hasn't led to prosperity. So maybe
yeah,
we should be talking about prosperity.
yeah. And to your point then, like, as people have just got really stuck on this first piece, right? Where it's like nobody's really talking about the rest of it because his priorities after he gets past the takeaways around figuring out how we continue to reduce the cost of essentially low emission solutions across industrial kind of applications, whether that's cement or energy production or agriculture. Like, that's a lot of what you and I have been talking about through all of this stuff. And then the other piece around, like, how do we measure and how do we have proper metrics? And again, for me on the emissions side, like, we don't measure emissions. We calculate them. And so this idea of like continuing to invest in better measurement, even just on the emission side, is huge. Never
Yeah,
mind
it's not
then.
measured, right? Like let's
Yeah.
start there. Like emissions are not measured; they're calculated, they're forecast. It's sort of like
Yeah.
a
So, like, his
more or less we're going to end up
takeaways
over here.
and his priorities, which are not getting any airtime, to your point, are still very aligned with where he's focused and where he's putting money. So anyway, like, it's there's a
Yeah,
lot.
no. So like I think that you're annoyed because like he's feeding this machine that is like, it's all about it's this like logic of like it's all about energy access and it's all about like making energy more uh, cheaper and more efficient and whatever and whatnot. So like you're annoyed because he's feeding into that argument. I'm actually annoyed because everybody on the climate side is sort of, that coming out guns blazing, explaining why Gates is wrong. So I've read commentary that Gates doesn't address tipping points, right? So like the Earth right now is breaching multiple planetary boundaries that we need for the Earth system to function. When those boundaries are breached, you ultimately get to tipping points that accelerate climate change, right? So like one of the very or they create feedback loops, right? So like one of the very classic tipping points is ice caps melting, and then that accelerates sea level rise. There are others where like when temperatures rise to a certain level, trees like forests can no longer absorb carbon, right? And like because they can no longer absorb carbon, they actually start emitting carbon, and then you get that much more greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, and like temperatures rise that much quicker. So there are all these tipping points, and like people are kind of like coming out yelling that Gates isn't acknowledging tipping points, that he hasn't understood climate science, that I saw one commentator on air on national TV say that Gates was sunsetting his climate philanthropy. That's not true at all. Like, and that is not
No.
at all what this memo says, right? So, like, what this memo actually says, if you read all 17 pages of it, which is a bit of it was my Saturday morning task. So what he's actually saying is that we need to reduce human suffering, right? And I'm actually going to like pull this out. So he says our chief goal should be to prevent suffering, particularly for those in the toughest conditions who live in the world's poorest countries. So what he's saying is, and he says it over and over and over again, is that climate change will not destroy humanity as a whole. It will unequally impact people who are poorer, right? So like people in the global south or like in the global majority. Basically what he's saying is like in the global north and the west, like we have the financial resources to guard against the impacts, right? So like we have cooling, we're not going to die from heat stroke. We have heating, we're not going to die of cold. We're probably not going to drown in floods. Some people will, but basically what he's saying is like it's not enough to systemically wipe out the human race. However, it is enough to really, really, really do damage in the poorest places where people do not have the economic means to build up defenses and to adapt to temperature changes, and they will literally starve. Like, that's basically his point, is that if we're going to invest in climate action overall, we should invest to safeguard those who cannot safeguard themselves. And I actually, like, let's stop on then, like that on that chief goal. The chief goal is to prevent human suffering. I agree with that. Like,
Yeah.
I don't, I'm Camp Climate, and I'm like, I completely and entirely agree with his priority where he says that funding should flow to those who need it most.
Yep. And again, I don't, and if we start there, right, I think it's an area, we've been sort of talking about like what is something that everyone can agree on. And we've heard that kind of thing even from Secretary Chris Wright here in the US around, yes, climate change is real, but human flourishing and human prosperity should be the focus. And so I think, if we can all agree on that, but that's again to your point, that's not the headline that's coming out of this essay that Gates has
Not
written.
the headline that's coming out. It's not what people are picking up on. I don't
No.
know why he put that, like it's incredibly like it's framed in such a controversial way. It's almost like he intended for people to pick it up the wrong way. And then I'm like, is this just like a PR play? Whatever it is. Basically what he's saying, like, is allocate funding where it matters most and prevent human suffering.
Yeah.
Then he goes into the 5 priorities, right? So he actually starts talking about reducing green premiums and that philanthropic funding should be used to bring down the costs. So, like in the early stages of technologies and especially green technologies, there's a huge green premium on choosing the cheaper option. On choosing the greener
Sure.
option. Obviously,
Yeah.
not on choosing the cheaper option, right? But so, like the premium, for example, for sustainable aviation fuels is something like 300%, right? Like it's absolutely insane. So he starts laying out the 5 priority areas where green premiums should be brought down because they're absolutely critical to reduce emissions. So the areas are agriculture, their transport, their energy. They are, I'm
And
missing a couple.
industry,
Do you
cement and
remember?
steel,
Industry,
industry,
and buildings.
building.
Um,
Yeah.
which makes sense, right? So he basically says like all emissions can be traced back to these like 5 areas of application. And then he starts talking about like the breakthrough technologies that he thinks are going to really transition our economies into a place where it's more sustainable for the planet, right? So like he's in no way divesting from climate technologies. He's just saying we should be investing into those pivotal areas that are actually going to make life better
Yeah.
for everyone, right? Rather than investing in something that like his example is that, like investing in agriculture in the global south, actually like very low investments will create food security and like economic prosperity and better health outcomes for millions. And like I would just juxtapose that with like, some of the technologies that maybe breakthrough energy has pushed in the past that were much more on the like engineered removal side, where I'm like, well, those are the opposite of that, right? Like they're very, very expensive
Yeah.
developments that have limited applicability because we will not be able to solve climate change with removals alone.
Yeah. And you've talked about this before. I think even when I think in our permanence discussion, you talked about this as well of like, where do we put money in the carbon markets, which includes things like agriculture and emission reduction to make impact now, because then, as we get better technologies and stuff like that. So it's not really some of it. And the big takeaway from what Gates, the other thing I really took from the article is really around capital allocation, right? Like capital is finite. Um, and so it's like, where are we most effective? And I think the other piece for me that's really critical in this conversation, and we've talked about this before as well, or I've definitely talked about it a lot, is that like not the solutions aren't gonna look the same everywhere, right? Like in some parts of the world, it's lack of rainfall and it's too hot. In other parts, it's maybe people don't have proper heating. Like it's going to be, and there's too much rain, right? And there's flooding happening and stuff like that. So like it's not, these solutions are going to be very local. And and he talks about metrics as well, and he's like, temperature's a terrible metric. In some parts of the world,
Mm.
in some parts of the world, I would disagree, right? In some parts of the world, temperature is going to be a good metric, but it's not a metric in and of itself and in isolation. Like, what about including things like rainfall? And, again, if we're going to talk about farming and food security, yes, increasing temperature is challenging, but lack of rainfall, and what does that look like? Like, there's other metrics that could be included.
I mean, he's saying the metric should be lives saved, right? And I'm like, so like you are of course right. Like in some parts of the world, so like if you look at the Middle East, then temperature, like rising temperatures are actually what is going to drive deaths because it's going to become so hot that it's absolutely unlivable, right? I think the Gates argument is kind of like, and this is difficult, right? Because I don't think that we should weigh up one human life with the other. I don't think that that's morally the correct way to go about that. But effectively, what he's saying is like, if you look at the total number of deaths globally, way more people die from disease than people who die from temperature. And if you look at temperature, way more people die from cold than people who actually die from heat.
Oh,
Right. And he's saying, just like factually, we're no longer having a data driven conversation. And I think he's right. This is
yeah,
no longer a data-driven conversation, right? So, like, basically what he's saying is, like, change the metric to lives saved. That is much more effective than us getting together with, like, 200 nations and, like, a gazillion companies and NGOs, and everybody gets together and they all descend on Belém in Brazil, and then they sit there and they discuss whether, temperatures should be rising 1.5 or 2 degrees. Well, they shouldn't be rising at all, first of all, right? And, like, if we're sitting there and we're now in the implementation stages of the Paris Agreement, and we should be talking about what are we doing about mitigation, what are we doing about adaptation, then I just keep coming back to like lives saved is not a bad metric as compared to, are we at 1.5 or are we at 1.9? And I'm just like, that's so arbitrary, right? Like, what matters is like, how many extreme weather events are we experiencing? Are we losing housing? And do we still have access? Like, do we have food security? And like, do we have access to safe transport? That's what matters.
yeah.
The 1.5, 1.9, 2.1, like, they're just numbers.
Yeah. No, it's very true. And it's a good take on that as well in terms of going into COP. Like you said, like Gates has framed this. If you go through the whole essay, he talks about COP a number of times in terms of here's what I think the conversation should be, and here's how I think people should look at some of this. Which is again, some of that got completely missed in any headlines and stuff like that. The
Yeah.
piece that's kind of interesting, and at least Gates through his work and through the foundation and stuff like that has always had a big focus on things like vaccines and disease prevention and stuff like that. So I think he definitely has some remit to be talking about some of this stuff. But the thing that I've got a lot of friends particularly in Nigeria. Again, it's a big oil and gas community. I've been to Lagos and stuff like that. And I hear it time and time again from some of my friends and from companies that I work with over there and things like that with like the focus on Africa broadly is quite frustrating, right, to folks.
Africa is not a country.
It's
Yes.
yeah, Africa's one. Yeah, it's not a country. It's made up of
Africa is not a country. Like, there are vast
and
differences, right,
yeah,
between a
and
place
like
like Morocco and a place like South Africa.
yeah, and like particularly somewhere, like Nigeria where there is to be honest, I've traveled the world a lot, and Nigeria was one of the places where the difference between the very extremely wealthy and the very extremely poor is actually incredible. And the idea of foreign investment has helped Nigeria become one of the bigger economies in Africa, more broadly, but it's foreign investment. And so it's also then meant that all of their resources have also then been exported and they haven't then been used locally and things like that. And so I'm definitely seeing a shift around this idea of what does foreign investment mean? And what does that mean for the actual countries themselves? And if we want to talk about prosperity and things like that, foreign investment coming in to develop energy in somewhere like
Mhm,
Nigeria, how are then international companies thinking about domestic gas and domestic energy to get those that are very, very poor in somewhere like Nigeria and live in the slums? They're not, right? Like they invest so
mhm.
that they can then, you know, sell the gas and the
They're
oil on the open
extracting
market.
resources, they're not developing
Exactly.
domestic
So
infrastructure.
it's yeah,
Yeah.
so it's like there's this balance as well around like when we go into places that are not like Bill Gates is American, right? Like and we're seeing again at a time again, he's always been very involved in this kind of stuff, but I see it time and time again from the billionaire class where and from the oil and gas industry in particular, where they're like, "Oh, we need to go save poor Africa." And I'm like, "We're in the middle of a government shutdown where, like, millions of Americans are about to lose access to their health insurance. Like, why isn't Bill Gates
Mhm.
worried about that?" Right? Like, what's he doing there, right? Like, and it's I realize again,
There's
even the
so much in
poorest
that,
people in the
yes.
US, it's still yeah, even the poorest people here in the US are probably still much more wealthy than, again, some of the poorest people in places like Nigeria and in certain parts of Africa. But it feels a little bit condescending when it's like, "Oh, we're just gonna look at these problems in other parts of the world, but we're not gonna solve the problems at home." And that's frustrating. Like, I don't know, I
Yeah,
find
for
it very
sure.
hypocritical from the billionaire class here in the US who are just trying to line their own pockets because of their, like, "We're gonna make all this money, and, you know, gonna fly to the moon," instead of actually solving any problems. Anyway, climb down off my little
Yeah, we're
soapbox,
gonna
but it's
fly to the
frustrating.
moon and
And I
also lay off 15,000 people,
yeah.
who no longer have an income, right? And in this economy will really struggle to get a job. You've just said so much, like, there's so much in there to
Mhm.
unpack, so, like, I wanna pick up on a few, right? So, like, one is this idea of, like, what are we doing at home, right? Like, I think
Mm.
a lot of philanthropy is sort of, like, outward looking, right? As in, like, we don't invest at home, we invest abroad, and I'm like, like, I'm not in the States, so I think um, it probably eggs me on less because, like, on a global scale, like, I still do think that we should be investing in SIDS, like small and developing countries. I think we should be investing in the landlocked countries and the really vulnerable countries. So, like, on the whole, I agree with
Yeah.
it. But I think that
And
there's
I
something in
disagree,
there that you
don't get me
said
wrong.
earlier of, like, do poor Americans have that much more than poor, let's use Nigerians, right? And I'm just like, if you look at it, like, of course, like, if you take absolute numbers, of course they have more money, but do they have higher purchasing power, right? Where I'm like, there's plenty of Americans who are on food stamps, who are not entitled to any benefits, who no longer have any health coverage because Trump's done away with that, and who have basically no social safety net to get themselves back into housing and back into the employment market, right? So I'm like, they may have in like absolute numbers in terms of like dollars in the bank, they may have more than somebody who's abroad, right? But like there is real poverty in the US,
Oh,
right? And
yeah.
like I think we should acknowledge that
Huge.
there's a lot to do like in front of his own doorstep, right?
Yep. And I find, yeah, I find this pivot of the climate narrative to, yes, climate's important, but human flourishing or, human prosperity is really important. Again, I just find it a little bit hypocritical.
It
So
is, right? Like,
anyway,
I do think that we should be making our investments, whether it's infrastructure or energy or whether it's like climate label, like whatever the investment is, like I do think we should make them for the benefit of those who have the least. It's just that applies
yeah,
domestically as it applies internationally, right? As in like we should all be uplifting those parts of society who do not have the means to uplift themselves, right? Like I think that that's what philanthropy ultimately should be focusing on rather than maybe driving down the cost of like technologies that ultimately could be VC funded.
yeah,
Like I definitely do think that, right? It's just that like it's not like all poverty happens on an international scale. There are great gaps within countries that we need to address as well. And I think like one of the things that we're seeing, like not just in the US but also in Europe, is that the right more extreme side of the political spectrum is on the rise. And that doesn't necessarily, at least in my opinion, it doesn't necessarily come from racism. It comes from inequality. Like people
yeah,
don't have enough to make ends meet. People don't have jobs or they have jobs that actually don't pay them a living wage, right? Like there's a gap in healthcare coverage, there's a gap in education, there's a gap in opportunity, and ultimately people get angry, right? And like I
yeah,
think that that is what's shifting our political spectrum to the right, and that's something that I personally find very very scary.
yeah. No, it's very true, and it's because it's viewed. Um, and again, I went down a bit of a rabbit hole after the 2024 election where the left was viewed as this like elitist educated class that were being condescending to everybody else. And I can see how that narrative
We are.
came. Yeah, exactly. I know. I can see how that narrative came through. Right.
We're incredibly condescending to everybody else, right? Like, we're all
Yeah.
out here on LinkedIn telling people how they should buy, like, healthy, organic, like, non-GMO food, and I'm just like, "Who the fuck can afford that?" Right?
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, the other thing that is, I had a conversation recently with someone about like, and actually it was Bill Gates that they used as an example. And they asked me, they were like, what is Bill Gates known for? And even though I'm
Mm.
aware of all of these things that he does, in terms of, his Breakthrough Energies Fund and all the stuff he's done around vaccines, Microsoft, right? Like I use Microsoft Excel every day,
Computers.
and
Yeah,
he's
he's
known
known
for
for
Microsoft.
software. Yeah,
And, it's the same with all of these, I say all of these companies, right, and lumping them in, but, like, it's almost people wanna figure out how to make their $1 billion first, and then they'll help others, and it's not the other way around often, like,
of
and I think
course.
that's the tension, I think, between particularly your network and my network, where I feel like your network's a little bit more, like, coming from that place of, like, "No, I wanna help people first and money's later," whereas I feel like my network comes from the, like, "We're gonna go make $1 billion and then we'll maybe help everybody else out." Like, it's a and there's a little bit of a divide in that as well in terms of,
Yeah.
like, what does that mean, and how do people then even go about it, and I think that's where some of that tension comes in as well in some of this. So, which is why I think
Yeah,
my
yeah, I
net
mean, totally fair, right? Like, I have a lot of do-gooders in my network because I come from public sector, right? So, like, there's a lot of people who've actually dedicated their lives to, like, development aid, or
Yeah.
development work. So that's one side of it. But, like, I do generally think that, like, in philanthropy, generally speaking, what we see are extremely wealthy individuals who made their money first and are now using a portion of their money, usually not a very significant portion of their money, but they're using a portion of their money to uplift others, which generally, I mean, like, is a noble pursuit. You could argue that we could also just tax them, which is something that in most cases we don't do very effectively. And, like, if we tax them appropriately, we would have the resources at a state level to redistribute them as we see fit. But yeah, I mean, like, I think, like, on the whole, I think, what I'm seeing in business very much is, like, people earning their laurels as a businessman and then worrying about their legacy later, right? So there's all these legacy projects of, like, former CEOs who've stepped down from their primary company and are now investing in a cause, right? And they generally tend to, like, focus in on one cause, right? So it can be gender, it can be health, it can be sustainable development is a common one,
Right.
climate is a less common one, but also one. I think Gates has done really interesting things and that he's had two, right? So he started with the Gates Foundation, which backed Gavi, which is the vaccine alliance. So he's always worked on, like, public health, but public health for, I would say diseases that are largely ignored, right? So diseases that often occur. So, like, typhoid, diarrhea, diarrheal infections, malaria, like diseases that affect a very poor population who do not have the purchasing power to make pharma companies a lot of money. So, like, I think that there's something, like, I genuinely appreciate about somebody picking a cause that is so overlooked.
Yeah.
And, like, one of the metrics that he's put out there is that, like, for Gavi, if you look at the entire spending since 1999, it costs about $1,000 to save a life, right? And he's saying it's $1,000 to save a life. He's like, that's the metric that we should be using for climate investments as well, or for all philanthropic investments, right? As in, like, how many lives saved on the dollar, because there's limited public funding and limited philanthropic funding. So we should be spending it efficiently. And,
Yeah.
like, I agree with that. Like, it's very mathematical, right? And, like, it's a little bit sad to put an economic value almost on human life, but I don't disagree with his argument.
It's where though, and I think again it's gotten lost in the narrative, it's where that and he didn't talk in the article necessarily about it, but that's not what the cost would have been initially, right? And like in the energy space, like solar panels are a great example of that, where like solar panels now, and he does actually mention this in the article a little bit, are in
Yeah,
often cases the cheaper option in terms of
yeah,
getting a house power, right? And we've talked about this a lot. It's something
yeah.
I'm pretty passionate
And
about. It's
somebody
not
had to
the case
drive down that
everywhere.
premium.
You have to drive down that cost, and that's also the piece he's
Mhm,
talking about on the green premium, like, how do you drive down the cost of decarbonization activities,
mhm,
technologies, whatever it looks like, in the sectors that are
mhm.
gonna have the biggest impact, and so it's like, none of that has gone away, and yet it hasn't gotten any attention in the article, so it's
I mean,
frustrating in
so,
that
like, I
regard.
think what he's actually saying is, like, like, let's make all of those clean technologies, right? Like, whether it's a land use transition, materials transition, or a transport transition. What he's saying is, like, let's drive down the cost to the point where this becomes a cost competitive solution, and then the market will take care of it, which I think
Yeah,
is a
exa
wonderful way to look at it. I mean, if anything, I was surprised that agriculture featured as prominently in this idea of the interconnection of rural populations, like rural development, agriculture, food security, and health really comes out strongly in the article, right? Where he's really mapping out like people need to have access to nutrients to be healthy enough to like drive economic development to then have a more prosperous generation thereafter. And I think he does a great job at that. And like the reason that I call it out is that traditionally, so like the Gates philanthropic portfolio has two arms, right? Like one is the health one, which I've talked about with Gavi, and the other one has been climate through breakthrough energy. And like traditionally, breakthrough energy has been coming, it's just come down very heavily on the technology discussion, right? Like nature did not feature. I've actually had encounters with representatives of the organization where they actively lobbied against nature-based solutions in the climate space, right? Because there was a certain train of thought that all funding should go into technological solutions. So I've like traditionally I have not been, I'm just gonna say, traditionally I have not been a fan of their work. Right. Because
Mm.
like I thought it was very narrow minded. It was very single track and actually went out and actively undermined others. Right. And like I think it's important for us to remember that like for philanthropies, it's perfectly normal to pick a niche. And I think that that's healthy for one philanthropy to say, you know, we're going to focus on agriculture and the other one to focus on technology. I think that's perfectly valid. I actually think it's very important for funders to pick a cause. But I don't think that it's okay for one philanthropically funded NGO to go up against other solutions and then undermine the importance of nature-based solutions in a land use transition, right? And like, so historically, I've been quite upset with the breakthrough energy work in the policy space because it felt quite aggressive, like on the upfront. So like, if anything, like if there's a departure on policy on like the climate question in this memo at all, I actually think it's on agriculture. I think that that's the headline that nobody's written is that, you know,
Yeah.
like Gates suddenly is interested in agriculture.
And I mean, to your point though, it ties really well with the conversation around healthy people, right? Like you mentioned that at the beginning. And like, I mean, again, I go back to my own kind of experience with it. Like, again, I talked about Hawaii a lot. My husband and I are out there. Like,
Mm.
Hawaii's been going, as a state, has been going through a really interesting evolution on agriculture, where it used to be a very big agriculture, like, there was a lot of agriculture that was produced in Hawaii and stuff. And then that changed because of price. And something like 80 to 90% of all agriculture is imported into Hawaii. And so there's been a huge push to figure out how Hawaii as a state encourages and brings agriculture back into, so they're not so reliant on California in particular and other parts of the world. So it's like this stuff happens locally all the time. And it's something that, again, there's been historically then a lot of grants and stuff trying to help small farmers and small landowners really try and figure out how to help feed the food supply chain for folks on the island and stuff. So this happens all over the world, and it's very local, and it matters in terms of what that looks like and stuff like that. But like it does really matter, and like the focus on it, and how do we give people the ability to either grow their own food, get local food, have security of food. Because again, like we struggle in Hawaii to grow things like tomatoes and cucumbers because the climate's not right. But we can grow coffee, which has been a big conversation because the US is one of the biggest
Yes.
consumers of coffee, and we've now got tariffs on them. I'm so mad my
Prices
coffee
have gone up.
prices at the moment.
Yes.
It's insane how much they've gone up because we import it all, except for that we have this small
Yeah.
little like piece in Hawaii that does a lot of it. But it's this really agriculture. I agree. Like it does it has a huge impact on what we do, and on just our lives generally. Like everyone has to eat, and um, it's a big kind of conversation on it. Anyway, something I'm very passionate about in my spare
Yeah.
time, my like
And I'm
hobby
so
project.
happy, I'm so happy Gates is picking it up as an issue.
Yeah,
But yeah, so I guess
yeah.
like overall, also with an eye on the time, like my sense is like
Yeah.
if you look at this memo overall, like the first headline is framed terribly, right? Because it really opposes climate and poverty action. So this first headline that says climate is a problem, but it's not going to end human civilization, like it's terrible framing. I think if I dig deeper into the text, I would say that I actually agree, right? So the priorities are like driving down grain premiums so that clean technologies become cost competitive and like use a different metric for progress, right? Like for Christ's sake, don't measure temperature rise, but measure like lives impacted. I also agree. So, like, on the whole, I
Yeah.
don't think this is terrible.
Yep. The thing my takeaway from it, is that everyone is talking about it, right? You and I are here talking about it, your
Mm.
network's talking about it, my network's talking about it, and so, like, whether it was, Gates wouldn't have written this in a vacuum, right? Like, he's surrounded by PR people, he knows that what he says people are gonna read and that they're gonna talk about, and so I feel like, you mentioned this earlier, like, maybe some of the language was actually intentional, and I feel like it grabbed everybody's attention. Everybody is talking about it. I do feel like there is a bit, if we can bring, I say, both sides of this equation, right, to the table around the idea of how do we save human lives, maybe we can actually find some common ground, right? Like, which is, so I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if this goes any further and if it actually matters, or if it's just a headline and next week, everyone's talking about something else, which is kind of the world we live in. But I do think he has managed to sort of find something that I think and frame it in a way that has got both sides of the aisle kind of talking around, well, how does this work? How does this fit in with what different people's kind of perspectives is and stuff like that. So that's kind of my takeaway from it,
Yeah.
a little bit as well. Is like
Yeah.
it has kind of worked to drive a conversation, and that's the first step almost. Like,
Yeah, I mean, it
so
worked in terms of getting attention, right? And, like, maybe he just secretly, not so secretly, enjoys stirring the pot.
exactly. We'll see what happens and if it gets brushed under the table or if it's actually something that people can start to actually have policy conversations around and stuff like that. So anyway, with
Yeah.
that, I think we'll probably end this one and stay tuned. We're going to dive into kind of different topics around what's been going on in the shipping world as well as what some of the stuff that's been going on in the EU. So again, make sure you like and subscribe so that you can see some of those upcoming conversations. But Teresa, as always, it's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. See you very soon.